Proszę Państwa, zapraszamy serdecznie do fotelu. Już. Szanowni Państwo, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, dear friends, I hope all of you can hear me without the microphone. I'm afraid that's my idiosyncrasy. I prefer to speak without the microphone if that's possible. Can you all hear me? Before we begin, first of all, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to the organizers of this conference, in particular my old friend, Professor John Mitzkel, who's sitting up top, for inviting me. I'm profoundly moved, I must say, to be present at Warsaw University, in which I spent a good couple of years long ago. And standing here today, it doesn't seem like it was that long ago. So on a personal note, it really is a tremendous pleasure, but also a tremendous honor. We're very fortunate today to have an extraordinary panel to discuss relations between, on the one hand, Israel and the Middle East, and on the other hand, Poland and Central or East Central Europe, countries that have emerged in 1989 and 1990 and regained their places on the map of Europe. I must say, I feel I'm not entirely qualified to discharge the obligation with which I have been tasked, because I am not a practitioner of foreign policy, and it's often said those who can do, those who can't teach. And we have in front of us three seasoned ambassadors, all of whom have been at various times, and one of whom still is a practitioner of international relations, of foreign policy. On the other hand, it has often been said that an ambassador is a person who thinks twice before saying nothing. But I'm quite sure that today we will discover that that isn't really the case. I've been told, I hope I've been informed correctly, that I should spend a few minutes before we begin, before I turn the microphone over to our distinguished panelists, just to say a few words. And unfortunately, in my case, at least if you ask my children, they'll always tell you, Papa never says a few words, he always says a few hundred words, and usually a few thousand words. But I'll try to be brief. A few words about the history of relations between Israel and Poland, which I hope will provide the appropriate, well, context or background to what we're going to hear from our three distinguished panelists. Well, let me say first of all that bilateral relations between Israel and Poland, and of course I don't pretend to be entirely objective on the subject, but nonetheless I would say they can fairly be described as special, because certainly behind them lies the extraordinary legacy of 1,000 years of history of Polish-Jewish coexistence. And I needn't tell you that that history was punctuated by moments of tremendous triumph, but also of terrible tragedy. And certainly I think most of you are familiar with the fact that for many centuries, much, if not most, of world Jewry lived on the territories of what is today present-day Poland, or at least Poland in its wider borders, which eventually became the heartland of the Zionist movement of Jewish national rebirth and produced many of Israel's greatest and best-known luminaries. Influenced by the dramatic rebirth of Poland, some Jews in Poland saw in their native country an inspiring example of national struggle which would one day be emulated in the land of Israel. Now, of course, that story of the Polish-Jewish presence in Poland, for the most part, came to an end when the Germans and Austrians, and you forgive me that I don't use the word Nazis, chose Poland as the killing grounds of local and European Jewry, and Poland became embedded in Jewish consciousness, and we can speak about that later perhaps, as the epicenter of the Holocaust. But certainly in the years leading up to World War II, the government of Poland had actively supported the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine, above all as a means of fostering Jewish emigration, in other words, to reduce the size of the Jewish population in Poland. And it covertly, I don't know if this is known to you, it covertly aided the Jewish underground movements that struggled against the Arabs and the British. And after the war, it initially, at least initially, continued supporting the Zionist cause. And although Poland found itself in the Soviet orbit after the Second World War, relations with Israel continued right up until 1967. And with the outbreak of the Six-Day War, Warsaw followed Moscow's lead and severed relations, though privately many Poles, very contemptuous of Soviet Russia and its Middle Eastern proxies, were gratified that, and I quote, "our Jews beat their Arabs." Only at the end of the 1980s, with the onset of glasnost and the gradual disintegration of communist rule, was Israel able to reestablish its foothold in Poland, which I think we all understand had been a maverick among the so-called, well, people's democracies and the most important country in the region. And by 1990, with the rusted shackles of communism finally shattered, Poland was able to determine its own destiny, including its own foreign policy, which meant a reestablishment of relations with the State of Israel. Now today, more than 25 years later, Poland, we may say, is one of Israel's staunchest allies in Europe. Some would say it's the staunchest ally in Europe. We could discuss that. A member of NATO and the European Union, Poland is certainly the largest and most successful economy in post-communist Europe. And I would argue with the imminent withdrawal of Great Britain from the European Union, the country's influence in the pan-European organization as leader of the East Central European bloc can be expected to grow still further. I would also add that as a state that traditionally has seen itself as upholding a distinct national identity as a kind of national state, in Poland there is an understanding of, and one might even say an admiration for Israel, which is absent in Western Europe. Nowadays in other parts of Europe, a kind of national-oriented Weltanschauung, the idea of a nation-state, is generally seen as anachronistic and outmoded. Moreover, and this is an important point, there is no appreciable number of non-indigenous Muslims in Poland, and as a result, it's also been immune to the unrest plaguing many Western European countries. And its friendly policy toward Israel has, for the most part, remained quite constant. But I would say also, and it's important to note, that although Poland has not seen the kind of terrorist outrages, thank God, that have plagued other countries, and those outrages have often been directed at distinctly Jewish targets, that does not mean, however, that nativist anti-Semitism has been eliminated, as anyone who is at all familiar with the broadcasts of Radio Maria will readily testify. And it must be stressed also, and perhaps this is a subject for another discussion, that contemporary anti-Semitism in Poland is focused above all on dead Jews rather than live ones, really on the place of Jews in Polish memory. I'm only hinting at that subject, but that's a theme perhaps we might touch on during our discussion. It's also important to point out in this context that Polish scholars have been especially active in shedding new light on the history and culture of Polish Jewry, and to their very great credit, I would argue, they have not recoiled from dealing even with the most, well, excruciating aspects of the Polish Jewish past. I might also say, however, that Poland's history policy, whatever that means, is an irritant that does muddy relations between the two countries to a greater or lesser extent. I mean, we could discuss that. Today, certainly, there are innumerable professional and people-to-people contacts between the two countries in a way that I could tell you, as a student in Poland in the late 1980s, I would not have believed imaginable. I remember very distinctly, and this gentleman who's sitting here to my right, attending the first concert of the Israel Philharmonic Orchestra conducted by Zubin Mehta. I think that was in Warsaw in 1987, if I'm not mistaken, and I remember the sense of exhilaration of the people in the audience that something was happening here. This was something that transcended a mere cultural happening, that Israel was finally in a position to reach out to Poland and Poland to reach out to Israel. Certainly the constantly growing tourist traffic between the two countries is facilitated by an increasing number of flights. You may not be aware of this, but today you can get on an airplane in Katowice or in Lublin or in Rzeszów and fly directly to Israel. And Polish-Israeli trade has flourished in recent years, and the trade turnover presently stands at over $1 billion. The field of high tech is also seen as especially promising, and Polish firms are working closely with Israeli startups as they seek to replicate on the Vistula the experience of what in Israel is called the startup nation. Cooperation in the military and intelligence spheres has also been particularly intense and fruitful, and Poland is interested in Israel's advanced cybersecurity technology. There's understandable concern that in Israeli and Jewish circles, particularly among the tens of thousands of Israeli high school students who visit Poland every year, that this country will primarily be seen as a place of Jewish suffering and death. I'm happy to say that in recent years, many efforts have been made to reveal the face of modern-day Poland, not only as a place of Jewish martyrdom, but as a thriving democracy whose people played a major, if not the major role in the struggle to end communism, and of course also as a vast repository of Jewish history and creativity. And as I said, thanks to these low-cost airline flights and direct connections, just as an example, Warsaw has become a popular weekend destination for Israelis, and Poles have also discovered Tel Aviv's sandy beaches and fabled nightlife. So we could say that kind of normalization is something that is very positive. Now, I feel I haven't really done entirely what I'm supposed to do, because at least ostensibly, the topic of our discussion is not merely Poland, but also the other post-communist countries in East Central Europe. I would tell you, and here I am speaking from personal experience, that colleagues in Budapest and Bucharest and in several other Central European capitals can also report on similar developments, particularly as Israelis who have roots in those countries have rediscovered them, and Hungarians, Romanians, Lithuanians, Slovaks, and others have found, after many years of a lack of contact, suddenly a common language with people whose parents and grandparents had once lived beside their own. And that's, of course, something that all of us should find very gratifying. I suspect I have probably spoken, as my sons would have told me, for too long. So without further ado, I would like to turn the microphone over to our panelists, which means I get to get off my feet. You can also hear me even from the sitting position, I hope. So, with your permission, I would like to introduce our first speaker. I'd like to introduce her, if I can find her biography. Here we go. And that is Agnieszka Magdziak-Miszewska. And for those of you who don't know Polish, you will understand, having heard her name, why it's often said that the hardest job in the world is to be the roll call officer in the Polish army. So Agnieszka Magdziak-Miszewska is a literary philologist, a journalist, and a diplomat. In the 1980s, she was associated with the Catholic intellectual journal Więź, and she later served as deputy director of the Independent Center for International Studies in Warsaw. Her government postings include stints as consul general in New York and as deputy head of mission in Moscow. She was, for 5 years, ambassador in Israel? Almost 6 years as ambassador in Israel, and also served as an advisor on Polish-Jewish relations in the office of the Prime Minister, and was also an advisor to the Minister of National Defense. Ambassador Magdziak-Miszewska is presently the coordinator of the Roots project developed by the journal Więź, which is devoted to exploring relations between Judaism and Christianity, and if I'm not mistaken, was founded by Ambassador Ronald Lauder, who I'm pleased to acknowledge as well.
Okay. I will use mic. I don't know if my voice will be so loud as Laurence. So if you agree, I will continue for 2-3 minutes to elaborate the Polish-Israeli relations and my experience from being an ambassador in this beautiful country. And later I would like to elaborate a bit about the Israel and the region because the name of the panel is Israel, Middle East, Poland, East Europe. So I should say that when I came to Israel in 2006, the relations, Polish-Israeli relations, were very good thanks to my predecessors. I know that the new beginnings after the fall of communism was very difficult because Poland was absent in this country for many, many years. Our voice, there was no Polish voice in the discussions on what has happened during the Second World War on Polish soil. And the situation was that if, let's say, the young Israel, the destination of young Israelis, one of most popular in Europe was Berlin. That Warsaw was, let's say, white place on the map. So this is why, perhaps, when the decision of the Polish government was taken to conduct a very special event or the series of events called Polish Year in Israel. Why I'm talking about it? Because having numerous and very important declarations, memorandums, the law base for relations between two countries and a very good relations on the governmental level, still the public of both countries, but mainly Israeli public, was rather, let's say, in some segments hostile, in some segments relevant to what Poland is. So, taking this into account, let's say the decision was taken to start the public diplomacy, to reinforce the public diplomacy. So the Polish year, which took part in 2008 and 2009, was very carefully prepared by almost 1 year activities. I mean, inviting the very important people of Israeli culture, curators, directors of the museums, filmmakers, directors of the theater, directors of the galleries, to invite them and ask them to come to Poland, to see the Polish culture, to see the Polish cultural life, and decide what can be, what can touch the Israeli public. The one thing, and the second, that was also there were also a lot of common Polish-Israeli project prepared. So I should say that after this year, the mood of the public, especially when we are speaking about, I don't know if it's possible to use the word elite now, because it's very unpopular, but let's say that the public opinion makers, at least, has been changed. And it became very en vogue to be invited to Poland to participate in Polish-Israeli projects. And many of Polish artists became very recognizable in the country. This is what I would like to stress, because I should say that as an ambassador in such on one hand, very friendly country, with very friendly government and ministers and agencies, governmental agencies, on the other with a lot of difficult experiences, stereotypes and prejudices, I should say that people to people policy is probably the best way to make all those beautiful agreements possible to fulfill, which we have still some problems with it. So this is one thing. The second, I was very, let's say, happy that during my tenure that was possible to upgrade Polish-Israeli political relations to the highest possible level. I mean the G2G, government-to-government consultations, which are conducted was held in November last year. So this is very difficult, as well as military cooperation between our countries. I will not elaborate a lot. I should only say that 2 years or 3 years ago, that was the first time when Polish and Israeli pilots mixed in the military aircrafts during the Safe Sky exercise. So this is probably one of the examples how much trust has been built between the two military bodies, to pilots and armies, and the very important thing, the common trainings of our special forces as well. Larry elaborated about the commercial R&D. That's fine. Another thing, and what I would like also to stress, that being an ambassador in Israel is a very unique experience to touch and to feel the country in a very hostile environment. Because despite the peace agreement,